the media have managed to invert the truth. The truth is that they're the extremists and we're the moderates. And we always have to fight that narrative. It's a constant battle. It's one that I tried to emphasize throughout the leadership contest. And ultimately, if we take the approach to the national conversation in that way, always responding forcefully to the claim that we're on the fringe of the political spectrum, and revealing to the public that in fact those who are criticizing us are the extremists, we'll win this argument at the end of the day.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada. Welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. Now, anyone who's seen Elizabeth May, who is the former leader of the Green Party, speak knows that she was a real firecracker. She was just extremely courageous and smart and had really bold policy ideas. And when she stepped down from party leadership last year, I believe, there was an election for a new leader of the Green Party. And during this election, I became aware of Dimitri Lascaris, who ran a very, very strong campaign and ended up coming second for the leadership. Before entering the field of politics, Dimitri was a class action lawyer, an activist, and a journalist and correspondent with the Real News Network. I was able to sit down with him and pick his brain on a wide range of issues, with the overall theme being, ideas on how to reclaim democratic control over our institutions and our branches of government. So we touched on a lot of different things, and I think that you'll find it's a very informative discussion. So thanks for watching and enjoy. Welcome to Propa-Ganada. Dimitri, how are you doing today?
Very good, Jacob. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So I'm going to start off. So you're an eco-socialist, and I wanted to start off with a quote from Murray Bookchin, who's one of the pioneers of social ecology, okay? So this is the quote. Social ecology is based on the conviction that nearly all of our present ecological problems originate in deep-seated social problems. It follows from this view that these ecological problems cannot be understood, let alone solved, without a careful understanding of our existing society and the irrationalities that dominate it. So I was kind of wondering, what's your reflections on this quote, and how does eco-socialism, these ideas, how are they reflected on your politics?
Well, I think he's right, but I would go one step further, and ask, what is the source of the social problems which are causing these deep, profoundly dangerous ecological problems we confront? And I think it all comes down to one thing, and that is the quality or lack thereof of the leadership that we have. Every single crisis that we confront, whether of a social or an ecological nature, is a result of insufficient political will or intentional manipulation of the political system to the advantage of the few, or political fraud, dishonesty. Really, the worst aspects of human nature at the leadership level are the core causes of all of these problems that we're confronting. So I fully embrace what he said, but I think ultimately we can boil it down to that. Every single problem we confront has a known solution. Every single problem, every single solution is within the realm of practical reality, what we can achieve. All that's lacking is the political will. And so that's what ultimately, sorry to cut you off, just to finish, is that was the singular reason why I entered into the very toxic arena of politics. It's not because I have any burning desire to be a politician or hold political office. So as I looked around me, I looked across the wasteland of Canadian politics, and what I saw were people who were leading us down the path of annihilation because of their own inherent flaws. So that's the core of it, to my mind.
Yeah. So I'm of the mind that if the average person, the average Canadian, actually took a deep look at Green Party platform, that most of the platform points are pretty rational and pretty legitimate, and there's this disconnect between that and how the Green Party is portrayed in corporate media. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how corporate media slants and kind of manufactures the consent to see the Green Party as not a real player in Canadian politics.
Mhm. Well, the signature issue of the Green Party of Canada is the climate crisis. I think this is a very good example of how the Green Party is marginalized and misrepresented to the public. The Green Party of Canada has put forward a set of policy prescriptions to resolve the climate emergency that actually arguably aren't as aggressive as they should be. They're actually reasonably modest. I think that they stand a good chance of fulfilling the needs of the moment and enabling us to avoid a climate catastrophe, but they aren't radical by any means. And what the corporate media does with respect to, our policy prescriptions, for example, what we've asked for in terms of a carbon tax, our call for a ban on fracking, it characterizes these things as economically disastrous and as politically infeasible, when in fact there is no greater disaster confronting us than the climate crisis itself. So if you're not going to adopt even what I regard as a relatively modest platform to deal with the ecological crises we confront, which is what the Green Party's put forward, you are the radical, you are the extremist, you are the person who is out on the fringes of political, economic, and social reality and environmental reality. So the media have managed to invert the truth. The truth is that they're the extremists and we're the moderates. And we always have to fight that narrative. It's a constant battle. It's one that I tried to emphasize throughout the leadership contest. And ultimately, if we take the approach to the national conversation in that way, always responding forcefully to the claim that we're on the fringe of the political spectrum, and revealing to the public that in fact those who are criticizing us are the extremists, we'll win this argument at the end of the day.
Right. Like, because I forget who said it, but capitalism itself is a revolutionary force, right?
Revolutionary, extremist, inhumane, pick your epithet.
Yeah.
It is anybody who defends the system and regards themselves as a moderate needs to take a good look in the mirror.
And that's why you don't really shy away from calling yourself a socialist. You don't buy into that. You don't apologize for that, right?
No. And I resist the criticism that, that so people are afraid of the word socialism. We have to stand up and say, no, actually, we're not afraid to call ourselves socialists. We're not going to use, watered down language like progressive. What the hell does progressive mean? I mean, every man and his dog characterizes himself or herself as a progressive nowadays.
Right.
We're socialists, and we should be proud to say so.
Right. Now, can you talk a bit about think tanks, lobby groups, industrial organizations that assert a disproportionate amount of power on electoral politics, so that leading to this marginalization of opinions such as Green Party platforms that are basically what most Canadians would agree with. So some of the forces that Canadians should be keeping their eyes on that are putting their foot on the scales
Yeah. Well, you have first of all an extraordinary degree of concentration in the media today, and the vast majority of media outlets upon which the vast majority of the public rely are owned by a small handful of corporations, for-profit entities whose natural inclination is going to be to slant the news in order to achieve their narrow, selfish economic objectives. And then we have a series of think tanks like the Fraser Institute and the C.D. Howe Institute, which these corporate media outlets quote routinely and characterize as being nonpartisan commentators on and specialists, experts in political and social realities. And so they reinforce each other by the corporate media, by relying on right-leaning, pro-capitalist think tanks that are mischaracterizing themselves as nonpartisan and independent. They are themselves, advancing the agenda that the owners of these corporate entities want to pursue. And at the same time, they're lending legitimacy to these entities by quoting them constantly in the media. They're feeding into the narrative that these are reliable purveyors of information. So this combination of these independent think tanks and these consultants you see coming on the news, sometimes they're not affiliated with any one of these think tanks, but they themselves have their own narrow political pro-capitalist agenda. and the media, and then politicians who are beholden to the ultra wealthy, this is what I call the trifecta, okay, they have created a false reality for the Canadian public, which is ultimately inducing people to make choices at the ballot box that are contrary to their own interests. So we have to expose them. It's absolutely essential that we expose the Fraser Institutes, the C.D. Howe Institutes, the owners of media organizations like Post Media, the ways in which the political class are serving their interests and not the interests of the public. And particularly, I think an absolutely revealing example of this is the recent motion by the NDP in support of a puny little 1% wealth tax. The Liberals and the Conservatives voted against this motion, very, very modest. I would say not even close to being what we need in terms of a wealth tax. They voted against it, even though I believe it's in excess of 80% of Liberal Party supporters support a wealth tax, and 64% of Conservative Party supporters support a wealth tax. You know, immediately the question must be asked, whose interests are the Justin Trudeau's and Aaron O'Toole's of this world serving? If the vast majority of your own members and supporters are saying they want a wealth tax and you vote against it, you're clearly not serving their interests. You know, whose interest does that serve? The wealthy.
So, what would be one mechanism to remove the monopolized media power? What is one way? Would it be trust busting?
Trust busting, absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely. We should break up the Post Media in particular. I think owns. I think at one point it owned almost 2/3 of the newspaper outlets in this country. It still has, you know, all the major dailies. It has the Ottawa Citizen, the Calgary Herald, the Vancouver Sun. It owns Global. It owns that disgusting right-wing rag, the Toronto Sun, the National Post, the Montreal Gazette. I mean, you know, it has almost all the major dailies with the exception of the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail in its portfolio. This is outrageous. All of those newspaper organizations should be separated and taken out of the Post Media empire. So we have to engage in trust busting. We need to find a mechanism, a democratic mechanism for funding independent, not-for-profit media. And Dean Baker, a journalist, an economist in the United States, a left-wing economist, came up with a very interesting idea where the government sets up a substantial fund to finance independent media, and then every eligible voter is given a notional share, an equal notional share in the fund, and they basically can vote for their allocation of that fund to be given to some independent media organization. And then when it comes to the CBC, in fact, is now heavily dependent on advertising. I mean, much of what you see on the CBC today is advertising because they need that money. And because they're dependent upon corporate money, there is absolutely no question that they are slanting their news coverage in order to avoid offending the major corporate interests in this country. So for example, they're not nearly as hard hitting as they ought to be on the question of the climate crisis, because a lot of their funding comes from their advertising revenue, comes from the fossil fuels industry, from the financial industry that is intimately intertwined with the fossil fuels industry. So we have to ensure that the CBC's funding is entirely from the government, and that it is stable funding, predictable funding, and that can't be reduced in order for somebody like Stephen Harper to penalize the CBC for coverage that he doesn't like.
Right.
So it's a series of reforms. If we do that, then we'll have a population that to a far greater extent is voting in its own interests rather than the interests of the wealthy few.
Right. And I think we share an assumption that if people are equipped with good, accurate information, they'll make a more pro-social decision at the ballot box, right? Yeah.
I was just talking to a friend of mine who's also a socialist yesterday about how it upsets me when I see people on the left denigrating voters, calling them idiots, morons. You get the leaders you deserve. I think this is profoundly wrong. I mean, there are several reasons people do generally vote contrary to their own interests, but it's not because of a lack of intelligence or goodwill. It's because A, they've lost confidence in the authorities due to the fact that they've constantly lied to them. B, they're being manipulated. They're not being given the information that they need in order to make fully informed decisions. And C, because many of the people who are making these decisions are simply struggling to survive. So, they're so worried just about making their next rent check or feeding their kids. They don't have time to do the kind of due diligence that is necessary to break through the misinformation that we're being given.
Right.
I'm fortunate enough. I'm effectively semi-retired. I don't have to worry about my next rent check. I don't have to worry about feeding my kids. So I can spend hours every day cutting through all the nonsense that the corporate media is giving me and figuring out what the reality is. Most people don't have that luxury.
Right. And Chomsky speaks about, turn of the century, how working class people were way better educated, way better read in terms of pamphlets on the street corner, and regular discussions not being, this is my own little tangent, but discussions not being related to sports games and TV shows, but it was more cool to be talking about things that affect every aspect of our lives. And I find that's a huge change. And it's, I was wondering, Dimitri, about so in Canada, the regulations on campaign finance are, I believe, to be more stringent than in the United States. But I was wondering from your perspective in the political process, how does big money still influence, and this is a big question, I know, but what are some of the ways that big money and big donors still influence elections?
Well, it's far worse in the United States than Canada. I mean, effectively, there's no limits in the United States now as a result of a U.S. Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. And so you have, I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign raised, I believe the number was like $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion in the presidential number. And that doesn't include all of the other fundraising they did in order to secure the nomination that Biden did, right? That was just the presidential campaign. So here we have much more stringent limits, but in my view, they're still too high. So for the current electoral, for this year, I believe at the federal level, it's $1,625 that you can vote. That's to federal parties. Then there's an amount of money you can donate to provincial parties, and it varies from province to province, which can be quite substantial. And then there are municipal elections where the restraints are even less stringent than they are at the federal level. So, most people can't contribute that kind of money. They can't contribute $1,625 a year to a federal party or a federal candidate. So generally only the people who are relatively well off, you don't have to necessarily be ultra wealthy to pay that kind of money, but you need to be reasonably affluent. So I think we need to lower the contribution limit, even though it is much better than the United States, it's still way too high. Here in Quebec, at the provincial level, it's $100 a year. I think that's a much more reasonable limit. And there's an argument to be made that you should eliminate private financing of election campaigns entirely. And it should all be government funded. And the money should be distributed in some manner that's objective and democratic. So that's something we definitely have to do. We have to reduce the presence of money in politics. But also this goes back to what we were talking about the media. You need to have truly independent media, informed media, not-for-profit media, who are providing voters with the information they need to make informed decisions. And you have to eliminate, another thing that I think we have a problem with is our educational institutions at the post-secondary level have become too dependent upon donations from the affluent. So we need to do a better job of funding them so that they are doing the kinds of research and analysis we need them to do in order to keep our citizens informed. And we need to really put the brakes on these so-called think tanks that we were talking about and the ways in which they're corrupting public discourse and deceiving the public into acting in a manner that's contrary to their own interests. So there's a range of reforms. Right now, I think because of all of these things, because of the influence of money in politics, because of the concentration of the media in the hands of a few wealthy persons, because of the nefarious influence of think tanks and so forth, we don't really have a democracy. What we have is what I call a quasi-democracy. It has elements of democracy, but it isn't really a system in which voters are making fully informed decisions about who is going to represent them and what policies the government is going to pursue.
Can you talk more about our education systems, both secondary and graduate level? And this, you kind of already touched on it, but could you expand a little bit more on that? How maybe like how economics departments have basically become ideological schools for free market capitalism and other forms of, well, I mean, now I'm answering the question, but Can you talk about the second, like education, the role that we can, and possible things we could do to help realign it so that it becomes a bit more pro-social?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example. There was my alma mater, the University of Toronto, recently. There was a huge scandal there about the dean of the law school having intervened in the hiring of a highly qualified academic because a wealthy benefactor of the law school phoned him up and said, I don't like this person's research. I don't want that person, on your faculty. And so he intervened and prevented that person from coming on faculty. And so it's not excusable at all, but why did he do that? He did that because of the financial pressures that university institutions are under. When you need, some extraordinarily wealthy person to donate to your educational institution in order to maintain a high caliber of education and staff, facilities, and so forth, it's inevitable that you are going to make decisions about hiring and firing and about your curriculum, about the types of research your institution is doing in order to cater to the demands of your benefactors. You ultimately will pay the piper. And that's true in education, it's true in the media, it's true in every facet of our economy and our society. So we need to free our educational institutions entirely, 100% of dependence on the private sector. They should be completely publicly funded. Another thing we should do, I think, is we should abolish private schools. I don't understand why we have a two-tier system. It's effectively private schools are for the affluent. And, I think everybody should be obliged as a matter of law to attend a fully publicly funded educational institution. And it should be free at every level. So nobody is deterred from pursuing a post-secondary education because of the cost. We don't have any of that in our society. And so all of these things are ultimately influencing the way in which our young people are being educated and the type of research that our educational institutions are doing.
Now, so following that back, so that would take money. So let's talk about tax reform. So talk a little bit about, the argument on of liberal and conservative circles is, there's just balance in the budget. There's not enough money. And I mean, obviously that we're living in unbelievably unequal times. So talk about the best mechanisms to tax the billionaires or to get rid of the billionaires.
Yeah, well, I don't see why we don't have a wealth cap. And I mean, the hypothetical I like to use to make the point about a wealth cap is this. Imagine a world in which 99% of all wealth was owned by one person, and 1% of humanity, 99% of humanity owned 1% of the wealth. How many people in this world would say that that's an acceptable situation?
Yeah.
Virtually no one that you and I know. The vast majority of people would say that's absolutely offensive. Now, of course, that's not the world in which we currently live. And maybe we'll never find ourselves in so extreme a situation as that, although the way we're going, I wouldn't rule it out entirely. But the point is, if you find that offensive and you say that would be intolerable, then what that means is that, at least implicitly, you're acknowledging the propriety of having some limit on individual wealth accumulation. Yeah. And then it just becomes a question,
where do you draw the line? Yeah,
where do you draw the line? And that's a reasonable discussion we can have. Right now, there's no line.
Yeah.
Literally, I mean, Jeff Bezos, I think his wealth is now up at 178 billion. The man's richer than most countries, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
And his net worth went up by $70 billion during the pandemic. How can any right-minded person think that this is acceptable? So let's have a conversation about what the limit should be. Right now, we're not even acknowledging that there should be a limit, even though I think in our heart of hearts, the vast majority of us would say, if we thought about it, that there should be.
Yeah. And
there's a way we can implement a limit. You just tax increases above that limit at a rate of 100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we can do. And then if you don't want to, actually put a hard limit, you can still have the kind of, wealth tax that, the Green Party and Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are proposing, Elizabeth Warren proposed in the United States, where every year they pay some small percentage, above a certain threshold, $10 million, $20 million, some small percentage is paid in a wealth tax. So that's something we got to do. It's absolutely ridiculous that passive income is taxed at a more favorable rate than employment income in this country. So that we have, in fact, the opposite should be true.
Of course,
we should be taxing passive income at a higher rate, not a lower rate.
And passive income, and we're talking about investments and stuff, right?
Capital gains,
yeah.
So you put your money in who gets to put money in a stock market and make millions? Wealthy people. Yeah. Okay. Workers of this country don't have the money to invest in the stock market in significant amounts. So it's the wealthy who are benefiting from this differential treatment between investment income and employment income. We, at a bare minimum, we should tax them at the same rate, but I think we should actually tax investment income at a higher rate.
Yeah.
And we're not even having a conversation about that in this country. We should be increasing the top marginal tax rate for most of the post-World War II period not most, but much. In Canada and the United States, which is no socialist country, the top marginal tax rate was over 90%. Over 90%. And now people freak out if you say 70%.
Yeah.
People, I mean, in the mainstream media, but not the general public. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez last year proposed a 70% top marginal tax rate in the United States. And they did a poll and they found a majority of Americans supported it. So that's another thing we have to do. And then, so that would take care of, or at least diminish the extreme wealth at the top end of the wealth spectrum. At the bottom end, we need to have a guaranteed livable income available to each and every citizen to ensure, and livable, in other words, it would be tailored to the cost of living in whatever community the person actually live, to essentially eliminate poverty in this country. There's no excuse for poverty. And once we do that, then we'll have a shot at actually having a real democracy. Yeah. Because we won't have people who are so burdened by the exigencies of life that they can actually engage in civic life, and be responsible and informed citizens. And secondly, we won't have people who are so wealthy that they can manipulate the political system to their advantage.
Right. It's almost like a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop, that it becomes more and more democratic.
Right. People then will start supporting policies that are even more egalitarian.
And protecting institutions that are,
Absolutely.
Okay. So you touched on poverty and, well, let's talk about homelessness, and let's talk about the housing markets and how can municipal, provincial, federal governments play a role in preventing housing from being such a commodity and not a right.
Well, we should be, first of all, building a lot more social housing, government-run, not-for-profit housing available in every single community in this country, and we should be taxing, people who hold property and keep it empty for speculative purposes. We should have vigorous controls on rent, which we don't have in this country. I mean, if we were to do that, we would go a long way. And I think potentially just adopting those three measures: vigorous, intelligent rent controls, vast expansion of social housing, imposing financial penalties on those who speculate in real estate. Those three things, I believe, would be sufficient in order to eliminate homelessness in this country, or essentially eliminate homelessness in this country. It's absolutely unforgivable that one of the wealthiest countries in this world has on any given night tens of thousands of people living in the street. Unforgivable. Last year in 2019, shortly after the whole controversy erupted in Venezuela with the Lima Group supporting Guaido, the charlatan, and calling him the president, I went down to Caracas, which at that point in time was in a severe economic crisis, in order to talk to people and see for myself what was happening. And I walked around the city at a moment in time when the economy was being devastated. There was hyperinflation. The economy was being devastated by sanctions. And to be frank, economic mismanagement as well. And I saw almost no homeless people anywhere. I went to the poorer parts of the city, middle-class parts of the city, affluent parts of the city. I saw almost no homelessness. When I came home, I stayed in a hotel one night in Toronto, and I walked from my hotel, which was up around, I would say like Bay Street and Gerrard. I walked down to the train station. So I went right through the Bay Street area, the financial center of this country, and I saw at least 12 homeless people. This was like a kilometer I walked. Okay, in the richest part of the city, right in the financial center, 12 homeless people. I spent a week in Caracas. I think I saw 3 homeless people during the entire week. It's outrageous that our country has so many homeless people, that has any homeless people at all. I don't know how we can claim to be a humane society when we tolerate that kind of terrible existence for so many of our fellow citizens.
How do mythologies in Canada about our identity, how are they spun to blind us from reality and make us feel like polite, good people?
The one thing that we're constantly being told, as you've indicated, by the mainstream press and by our political officials, and it's very pleasing to hear it as a Canadian citizen, that we are so nice and so humane and we have this wonderful reputation around the world. Well, I agree with you that most Canadians, people at the grassroots level, ordinary citizens, they generally are very decent people and good people. But they're not the ones who are determining our foreign policies. They're not the ones who are determining our economic policies. They're not the ones who are determining their social policies. The ones who actually control those decisions, there's nothing nice about them whatsoever. These people are rapacious, they're inhumane, they're destroying the planet, they're engaged in plutocracy.
It's not very polite, is it?
There's nothing polite. There's nothing nice about it. There's nothing humane about it.
Yeah.
Our country at the leadership level is a habitual human rights violator, a habitual violator of international law. So if you're talking about the average ordinary Canadian, but I don't think this is unique to our country. I think ordinary citizens around the world tend to be very decent.
Yeah.
But the people who are leading us, a lot of them are just out and out sociopaths. So if you're talking about them, no, I don't agree with the notion that Canadians are nice at all. If you're talking about my next door neighbor, I agree.
Yeah, he's a good guy. In your view, what role should the government take when there are these disputes between private extraction industries and Indigenous peoples who have the have the right to having their land untouched by these operations?
Well, the government should legislate. In fact, I would go so far as to say it should be a constitutional requirement that the exploitation of the resources of the land of Indigenous persons would be subject to a veto by the Indigenous peoples who are the rightful custodians of land, an absolute veto. If they had a veto power and the veto was being enforced, so in other words, if collectively they said, no, we don't want our land being exploited in this way, our resources being exploited in this way, then I think the government could just step back and let them negotiate on their own behalf. They would have enough leverage to actually protect their own interests. Right now, they don't have leverage. And so what we have in effect in Canada is a duty to consult under the law. And even that is not vigorously enforced by the courts and the government. But essentially what our courts and our government, our law says is that if you go to an Indigenous group or community and you engage them in a conversation and you give it a good effort to try and secure their consent, but you fail, then afterwards you can basically say, too bad, we're going to do it anyways.
Yeah, we tried.
Basically deprives them of any leverage of actually determining the outcome. So what you have is the spectacle of large, extractive corporations engaging in a consultative process, it's just a formality they're going through. They don't ultimately intend to.
It's condescending. Yeah.
It's totally condescending. And they don't ultimately intend to comply with the demands of the Indigenous partners with whom they're negotiating. So we have to enshrine into law a veto right. And in fact, this is something that we put forward in the Green Party policy process. A number of us have come together and we're proposing a policy. We would support it as a party, the principle that a veto should be enshrined into law, the Indigenous veto.
Okay, so now everything is connected. So now let's talk about international trade agreements or investment agreements and how these agreements give disproportionate rights to corporations so that they wouldn't even be subjected to those kind of vetoes, or they could sue the government. So can you talk a little bit about that, the role of those international trade agreements?
Yeah, I mean, so it's very simple, and it's a story that's been told many times. Basically, when you eliminate barriers to trade, the principal barrier to trade are tariffs. Basic tariff is like a tax. So something's coming in here, you say, in order for it to be sold in this market, we're gonna tax the product. Okay, well that makes it potentially more profitable for the corporation to produce the product domestically because they don't have to pay the tax if it's made in Canada. If you eliminate those barriers to trade, then what happens? A massive global race to the bottom. Now every corporation out there is looking for the lowest cost jurisdiction. And that means the jurisdiction in which the wages are the lowest, where worker protections, safety in the workplace, for example, are the weakest, where environmental protections are the least vigorous. So you go to that low cost jurisdiction and then you transport the products at long distances without having to pay for the massive greenhouse gas emissions you're generating by transporting those products. You foist those costs onto everybody else, and then you bring them into the country tariff-free. And so now you're able to make far greater profits, but the jobs have been offshored to jurisdictions where there is virtually no protection for workers, the environment, human rights. So what do we have to do? We either have to re-erect There were many good things about trade barriers. Trade barriers can be a very effective way of protecting the local economy, protecting the environment, of ensuring that your trade partners are acting in a responsible manner. So either we have to adopt trade barriers, or re-empower our government to impose tariffs and other forms of impediments to importation where appropriate in the public interest, or we have to have enforceable mechanisms within trade agreements to ensure the protection of worker rights, labor rights, and human rights in the jurisdictions with which we're trading. Right now, we don't have either of those things. We basically eviscerated our ability to impose tariffs on products from jurisdictions where it's in the public interest to do that. And we have no enforceable mechanism to ensure. So now the Trudeau government's gotten clever about this. They're masters of this sort of thing. So now they're putting this airy-fairy language in the trade agreements, and afterwards they crow. Oh, look, we're protecting the environment and human rights and workers. But when you actually read these agreements carefully, there's no enforcement mechanism in them. None. It just says things like, the counterparty should do this or will try to do that. But if they don't do it, there's no penalty. So what we need is to have penalties built into the trade agreements that one country can impose on the other through, for example, the imposition of tariffs, or perhaps a complaint to a trade body, where the other party to the trade agreement is not complying with reasonable standards for the protection of workers, the environment, and human rights. That will require a wholesale renegotiation of all of our trade agreements. I can't think of a single trade agreement which is constructed in that way now. All of them are encouraging, facilitating, promoting a race to the bottom.
Yeah. Should the government be revoking more corporate charters of corporations that break rules, or should we stick to the fines?
Oh, well, I think we should definitely be revoking their charters and appropriate. The corporate charter is a privilege. Yeah. And you should have to conduct business at a very, very high standard in order to preserve and maintain that privilege. And if you don't, you should have it revoked. Absolutely. And we need to, I don't know, you probably have seen a documentary called The Corporation. And since we're talking about this, I have nothing to do with the documentary, but I want to recommend to anybody who's watching our discussion this evening to watch the sequel, which just came out. It's called A New Corporation. Oh. And you can rent it on YouTube for a few bucks. I watched it the other night. It's fantastic. And it focuses in particular on one particular sector of the corporate community, the technology industry, and how it's using technology in order to manipulate the public, destroy our privacy, engage in far-reaching forms of surveillance, and shape the economy in ways that advantage the tech moguls. But in any event, the corporate entity has been taken to an extreme, and it basically, the notion that the raison d'être of a corporation is to maximize profits for the shareholders has resulted in downright sociopathic behavior on the part of executives of corporations. And this is going on for decades. So we just have to completely reconceptualize what corporations are and have to impose far greater penalties on the people who are actually making decisions in corporations. We have to hold executives personally responsible and criminally liable where appropriate. And in appropriate cases, we should be revoking the corporate charter.
So speaking of criminality, let's talk just briefly about Canada's involvement in foreign wars, such as, against the Palestinians, against the Yemenis, and you kind of already touched on Venezuela, but let's talk about Palestine.
Yeah. So Palestine, I mean, what can I say? I'm just going to, I'll just quote the words of the Canadian government, that the settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, they don't call them the Palestinian territories, even though they are, the federal government calls them the occupied territories, that they're a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and that the annexation of East Jerusalem is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and the annexation of the Golan Heights, which under international law belong to Syria, violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. This is not just the policy of the Trudeau government. This was the policy of Stephen Harper's government. This was the policy of Paul Martin's government, and on and on and on. It has forever been, ever since 1967, when the West Bank was first occupied and Israel began to build settlements in the West Bank. And yet, what does the Canadian government do with respect to Israel? It engages in arms and surveillance trade. It has negotiated a trade agreement with the State of Israel, which it just deepened. It votes against resolutions at the United Nations that are wildly popular with the General Assembly. I mean, just now in the month of November, it was a part of a small group of states, which included the Trump administration, Netanyahu, and 4 tiny island states, which consistently voted against UN General Assembly resolutions, which are just a reflection of the Trudeau government's own foreign policy. That's all. The government is voting against resolutions which could be taken directly from the Trudeau government's own stated foreign policy. So all I'm saying with respect to Israel and every other human rights violator in this world is let's apply the same standard to our friends, and Israel has been deemed by our government to be a friend, as we apply to our official enemies. So let's look at a contrast. Russia. Okay, we have imposed sanctions on the state of Russia. What is the principal justification for sanctions on the state of Russia? The principal justification was what we call the annexation of Crimea. Now, what happened, in fact, was that there was a referendum held in Crimea when, after the United States engineered a coup d'etat in the Ukraine, which is exactly what happened, and in excess of 90% of the people who voted and over 80% of eligible voters voted said they wanted a union between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Crimea. And so they merged. Yeah. And then we imposed sanctions. So there's an argument to be made that that actually wasn't a violation of international law, but I don't want to have that debate. Let's say it was a violation of international law. Why are we imposing sanctions on Russia but not in Israel?
The United States told us to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, that's essentially our policy is just basically a limitation of U.S. foreign policy. Right. So, one other example I want to give, it just burns me no end. It is so appalling to me that we are selling deadly weapons to a regime that is committing effectively a genocide in Yemen. Yeah. Saudi Arabia is arguably the world's most egregious human rights violator, brutally oppressing women, brutally oppressing the Shia minority in the South, fomenting Wahhabi terrorism. And in fact, the 9/11 Commission had incriminating evidence that the Saudi autocracy was involved in some indirect way in the 9/11 attacks. And they suppressed the evidence. And we're selling deadly weapons to them. And what does Trudeau say? He says, well, the Harper government negotiated this agreement, and if we break the agreement, we are going to have to pay billions of dollars. Let's first of all note that he's never actually produced the contract so that we aren't in a position to judge for ourselves whether we would have to pay that penalty. But let's assume he's saying the truth. What he's effectively saying is that Canada puts a price on human rights. If the price is high enough, we'll just throw the victims of a human rights abuser under the bus. Okay, I as a Canadian will say without hesitation, even if we had to pay a few $1 billion to get out of that dastardly contract, I think we should pay it. And maybe we should throw Harper in jail for forcing us to have to pay that money. Right. Money that we could be spending on ending homelessness in this country and alleviating poverty. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we should not be putting a price on human rights. We should pay the damn penalty and not sell weapons to those monsters.
Yeah. And to add insult to injury, these same politicians are using rhetoric of feminism and anti-racism while supporting these atrocities, which disproportionately, I would imagine, in all these kind of situations, it disproportionately affects women and people. Well, they're all the people of color, right?
Absolutely.
But it's like we put up our walls and say those people don't matter. So and
it's racist. But our foreign policy is racist,
right? At the end of the day, right? But we don't talk much about foreign policy in Canada, so we can ignore that. Okay, 2 last questions. All right, let's talk about just a quick thought on police reform. Or what's kind of your general takeaways about how we could reform police across Canada?
Well, I think we have to. I'm ambivalent about the word defund because people seem to think, or I actually don't think most people, when they say defund in the anti-racist movement, mean eliminating the police altogether.
Right. What
they're talking about is substantial reductions in the money we spend on policing.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, but I'm a little wary to use that word because I actually don't believe we're at a place in our society where we can completely abolish the police. I think we should strive towards that goal. And I happen to believe that we can get there. I think we can't do that now. It's not practicable. What we can do is dramatically reduce funding for policing and reallocate those monies to the root causes of criminality. Okay, so what are they? It's not that most people who commit crimes aren't evil. Most people who commit crimes are desperate, or they're suffering from mental illness, or they're suffering from substance abuse.
Yeah. Street level crimes, right? We're not talking white collar crimes. That's a whole different story. But yeah.
It's a totally different. Yeah. But most of the people who end up in jail are those people, the people who are committing crime out of desperation because of mental health issues that are not being adequately addressed. So let's take a big whack of that money that we're spending on cops and spend it on them and their needs. And we will see a dramatic reduction very quickly, I believe, in the behaviors which we say make policing necessary. And eventually we will find ourselves in a world where there's almost no crime, virtually none. And we could have almost no policing, if any at all. So that's number one. But the second thing we got to do is we got to hold cops accountable. Or we're not doing that at all. We're doing a terrible job of that. Today, there was thankfully a conviction of a Calgary police officer who slammed a handcuffed and defenseless black woman to the floor. Her head bounced off a cement floor. But the only reason, in my view, that cop actually was convicted was because there was a video of this atrocity. You know, the stuff that is not being recorded, that is not being evidenced in a way that, the truth is unavoidable and the courts have to deal with it. I think that's going largely unaddressed in this country. And the vast majority of police brutality and police racism is not visible to the public, and it goes unpunished. So we have to have a system of accountability for the police. And I just don't see anybody in any of the major political parties, federally, provincially, who are serious about holding police accountable.
Okay, last question, Dimitri. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, let's end this on an uplifting note. Okay, so talk about can you kind of just list some of the most exciting movements or figures in Canada that are that you'd like more people to know about?
Well, I think we got the Wet'suwet'en blockades, the solidarity blockades. I thought were absolutely fantastic. I think we got a bit sidelined by the pandemic, but that's not going away. And so when we are in a position to actually go out into the streets again, when we've got this pandemic under control, I think we need to re-engage on the street level in solidarity actions with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And ultimately what that means, I mean, I have to say, I don't think that, I think that our experience has demonstrated that sort of the conventional type of protest where you mass in a square and you hold up signs and you give speeches ain't gonna cut it.
Yeah.
The powers that be have mastered the art of ignoring those kinds of expressions of dissent. The only thing they understand is financial loss.
Right.
So we need to actually shut down. This is what was so wonderful about the Wet'suwet'en blockades, is that they were shutting down infrastructure.
Yeah.
This is why the government started freaking out. And I think the government was basically, in one sense, saved by the pandemic because it put an end to that for the time being. But when we come out of this, we need to re-engage in economically disruptive forms of protest. And ultimately, we need to escalate to the point of a general strike and a series of general strikes where we shut down the economy. That's when they'll take notice. And I think that's coming. I think we saw the beginning of that. Extinction Rebellion is another example of this. They are actually, in very small ways, but noticeable ways, disrupting economic activity peacefully and not in a way that's actually devastating and causing harm to ordinary and vulnerable citizens, but in ways that are causing the oligarchy to take notice and to feel some pressure to actually respond to the demands of the movement. So those types of movements are burgeoning. I think we saw it with Occupy Wall Street, which was brutally suppressed, but it never went away. And as we get more and more into a world of existential danger, which is by the day, that's where we're heading, I think you're going to see much more of that kind of protest. And ultimately that, I think, can lead us to the promised land. When we begin to shut down the economy, they will begin to listen to us.
And I hope that our Canadian identity could transform into one where being polite is really taking, nonviolent actions to push for a better world for everyone, right?
Oh, we can shut down the economy politely. No need to be rude about it. So.
Anyway, so Dimitri, thank you so much. Thanks for jumping into the gnarly pit of politics and having some of the most down to earth but refreshing set of policies so thank you so much for taking the time on a Friday night to be with me.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Take care.
Cheers.